talking about something that could quietly reshape Canada-US energy relations. And if you blink, you might miss how important this really is. According to a recent Reuters report, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney was aware of discussions involving South Bow and potential Keystone XL-related pipeline planning before a key meeting at the White House with U.S. President Donald Trump. Now pause for a second. This is not just about an old pipeline project coming back from the grave. This is about energy leverage, trade power, and political positioning between two countries that are deeply economically tied together. The Keystone XL pipeline has been politically controversial for years, canceled previously amid environmental and regulatory battles. But energy demand hasn't disappeared. The United States still imports significant volumes of Canadian crude oil, and Canada still relies heavily on the U.S. as its largest energy customer. So, when reports surfaced that Canadian leadership was informed of revival discussions before high-level talks in Washington, it signals something strategic is happening behind the scenes. And here's where it gets interesting. Energy is not just oil in a pipe, it's negotiating power. When leaders meet, they don't just talk about trade numbers. They talk about security, supply stability, domestic politics, and economic resilience. If pipeline infrastructure discussions were already underway before Carney sat down with President Trump, that suggests coordination, preparation, and possibly leverage entering those talks. Now let's be clear, there is no official confirmation that the Keystone XL project is fully revived. What Reuters indicates is awareness of planning conversations. That distinction matters. This is about signals, not final decisions, and markets pay attention to signals. Energy investors, commodity traders, and policy analysts all understand that pipeline capacity affects pricing power and long-term supply contracts. If additional cross-border infrastructure becomes politically viable again, that could influence North American energy dynamics for years. At the same time, both leaders face domestic considerations. In the United States, energy independence and infrastructure development are politically powerful themes. In Canada, balancing environmental commitments with economic growth is always delicate. So any pipeline-linked development sits at the intersection of economics and politics. Now here's the strategic layer. Canada has recently been signaling efforts to diversify trade relationships globally, but realistically, geography still matters. The United States remains Canada's dominant trading partner. So strengthening or stabilizing energy flows south of the border can provide immediate economic certainty, even while broader diversification strategies unfold. From Washington's perspective, stable Canadian supply reduces reliance on more volatile international sources. From Ottawa's perspective, reliable pipeline infrastructure protects revenue and jobs. That's why this story matters beyond headlines. It's not about nostalgia for Keystone XL. It's about the structural reality that energy trade between these two nations is deeply intertwined. And if discussions are resurfacing at high political levels, it means energy security is again central to bilateral talks. Here's the part people often overlook. When infrastructure conversations happen quietly before formal diplomatic meetings, it usually means groundwork is being laid. Leaders rarely walk into high-stakes meetings without understanding leverage points. So the fact that awareness existed beforehand suggests preparation, not improvisation. And in geopolitics, preparation is everything. Now I'll add one small reality check. Energy projects of this scale face regulatory hurdles, environmental reviews, political opposition, and financial risk. Nothing happens overnight. But the signal itself is newsworthy, because when Canada and the United States start aligning again around pipeline discussions, markets, investors, and policymakers listen carefully. So the big question becomes, is this simply background noise, or is it the early sign of a recalibration in North American energy strategy? And that's what we're going to unpack further. Now let's go deeper into why this pipeline discussion matters right now and not 5 years ago, because timing in politics is never random. The Reuters report doesn't say a deal has been signed, and it doesn't say construction is restarting tomorrow, but what it does reveal is awareness at the highest political level before a White House meeting between Prime Minister Mark Carney and President Donald Trump, and that alone tells us energy was likely part of the strategic backdrop of their conversation. when leaders meet, especially between two countries as economically intertwined as Canada and the United States. Major sectors like energy are never accidental topics. Canada supplies the United States with millions of barrels of crude oil per day, making it America's largest foreign oil supplier, and that relationship has been stable for decades. However, stability does not mean it is immune to political shifts. Pipeline capacity determines how efficiently that oil moves, and efficiency directly affects pricing, investment confidence, and long-term contracts. If additional pipeline discussions are resurfacing, it could signal an effort to reinforce North American energy integration at a time when global energy markets remain sensitive to geopolitical tensions. Remember, energy security is no longer just about supply. It is about secure supply from politically reliable partners. From Washington's perspective, Canadian crude is predictable and geographically secure compared to overseas imports that require maritime routes. From Ottawa's perspective, the U.S. market is massive, established, and economically critical. That mutual dependence creates both cooperation and leverage at the same time. Now, here's where strategy becomes interesting. Canada in recent months has signaled efforts to diversify trade relationships beyond the United States, expanding engagement with Asia and Europe. But diversification takes time. Pipelines, on the other hand, are immediate structural commitments. They tie economies together physically, not just diplomatically. If planning conversations are happening again, it could mean both sides see value in reinforcing energy ties, even while broader geopolitical adjustments are taking place globally. Another key factor is investor psychology. Markets respond not only to official approvals, but to credible signals that policy environments might shift. When a Reuters report indicates high-level awareness before diplomatic talks, institutional investors read that as preparation. Energy companies look at regulatory climates, financial markets look at long-term transport capacity, and that can affect capital allocation decisions quietly behind the scenes. At the same time, political risk remains significant. Pipeline projects have historically triggered environmental debates, court challenges, and public protests, so any movement forward would need to navigate domestic political landscapes carefully in both countries. That means what we are watching is not a simple restart button, but rather a potential recalculation of priorities. Is economic resilience being weighted more heavily now? Is cross-border energy reliability being elevated as a strategic necessity? Those are the underlying questions. And let's not ignore the optics. When discussions connected to a previously canceled high-profile pipeline surface near the timing of a White House meeting, it inevitably attracts attention. Even if no formal announcement is made, the symbolism alone carries weight. Energy infrastructure represents long-term commitment. It signals that despite political fluctuations, the structural backbone of Canada-US trade remains energy-driven. So the real takeaway here is not about nostalgia for Keystone XL itself. It is about whether both governments are quietly reinforcing the core of their economic relationship at a time when global trade patterns are shifting. Energy is foundational. It powers industries, transportation, and national revenue. And when it becomes part of a high-level diplomatic preparation, it tells us something strategic is being evaluated. The important thing for viewers to understand is that nothing dramatic has officially changed yet, but the context suggests serious consideration. And in geopolitics, serious consideration at the leadership level is often the first stage of something bigger. Now let's step back and look at the bigger geopolitical picture, because this pipeline discussion is not happening in isolation. It is happening during a period when global energy markets are still adjusting to instability, supply chain disruptions, and shifting alliances. And that context makes every North American infrastructure signal more meaningful. The United States in recent years has emphasized domestic production and supply security, while Canada has balanced environmental commitments with its role as a major energy exporter. So when high-level awareness of pipeline planning surfaces before a White House meeting, it suggests both governments are evaluating long-term strategic positioning rather than short-term headlines. Energy infrastructure is not built for one election cycle. It is built for decades, and that means any serious conversation around pipelines reflects long-range thinking. If Washington sees stable Canadian crude as a way to reduce vulnerability to overseas supply disruptions, That strengthens the argument for reinforced cross-border capacity. If Ottawa sees guaranteed U.S. demand as protection against global price volatility, that strengthens Canada's economic stability. So while public debates may focus on politics, the structural logic underneath is about security and predictability. Now here's another layer people often miss. Infrastructure equals commitment. When two countries build pipelines, railways, or grid connections, they are physically locking their economies together. That creates interdependence, and interdependence reduces uncertainty. For investors, uncertainty is the real risk. So even early-stage planning conversations can shift perception about long-term North American energy integration. And perception matters because capital flows towards stability. If institutional investors believe regulatory resistance may soften or that political leadership is open to renewed discussions, energy sector investment strategies can quietly adjust before any public policy change is announced. But let's keep this grounded. Reuters reported awareness of planning discussions, not a finalized agreement, not construction permits, not funding approvals. That distinction protects us from exaggeration. What we are analyzing is a signal, not an outcome. And signals are important because diplomacy often moves in stages. Stage 1 is quiet awareness and preparation. Stage 2 is exploratory dialogue. Stage 3 is public framing. Only later do formal commitments appear. If we are somewhere between stage 1 and stage 2, that means both leaders likely understand the economic weight of the issue, but are measuring political risk carefully. And political risk here is real. Environmental groups remain strongly opposed to large-scale fossil fuel expansion projects. Legal reviews can delay timelines. Financial institutions increasingly factor climate considerations into lending decisions. So any revival scenario would need to navigate a more complex landscape than in the past. At the same time, global demand for energy has not disappeared. Transition to renewables is underway but incomplete, and heavy industry still depends on oil and gas. That creates a tension between environmental goals and economic realities, and leaders must manage that tension strategically. Now here's where the fun but serious question comes in. Is this a quiet reset of North American energy cooperation, or is it simply contingency planning in case global markets tighten again? Because smart governments prepare options even if they never use them. Preparation does not guarantee action, but it shows awareness of risk. And if Canada and the United States are reevaluating infrastructure resilience together, that tells us the bilateral relationship remains deeply pragmatic beneath political headlines. The core takeaway here is simple. Energy remains the backbone of Canada-US trade, and when it enters leadership-level preparation before diplomatic meetings, it deserves attention. So now let's bring everything together and answer the big question. What does this actually mean going forward? The Reuters reporting tells us that Prime Minister Mark Carney was aware of Keystone XL-linked planning discussions before meeting President Donald Trump at the White House. And while that does not confirm a revived pipeline, it does confirm that energy infrastructure was not an afterthought, it was part of the strategic landscape entering high-level talks. That alone tells us energy remains central to Canada-US relations. Strip away the politics, strip away the headlines, and the structural reality remains simple. Canada is the largest foreign oil supplier to the United States, and the United States is Canada's most important energy customer. Geography locks that relationship in place. Infrastructure strengthens it. And when leaders meet, they are not just discussing today's numbers, they are evaluating tomorrow's leverage. If pipeline capacity becomes more viable, it increases efficiency, stabilizes supply chains, and reinforces North American energy integration. If it does not move forward, the mere fact that it was evaluated shows both governments are thinking in long-term strategic terms. That's the real story here. This is not about relitigating past political battles. It is about preparation. Governments prepare options before they need them. Markets prepare capital before policies are finalized. Diplomacy prepares frameworks before announcements are made. So whether or not this specific project advances, the signal suggests that cross-border energy resilience is being reviewed at the highest levels, and timing matters. The global energy market remains sensitive to geopolitical shocks, supply disruptions, and price volatility. Stable continental supply routes reduce exposure to those risks. For Washington, dependable Canadian crude reduces reliance on distant suppliers. For Ottawa, secure U.S. demand protects export revenue and economic stability. That mutual benefit explains why energy repeatedly resurfaces in bilateral discussions, regardless of political cycles. Now here's the balanced conclusion. Nothing official has changed yet. There is no signed agreement, no construction timeline, no confirmed policy reversal. But high-level awareness before a presidential meeting suggests that serious strategic considerations are underway. And in geopolitics, serious consideration often precedes visible action. The most important takeaway for viewers is this. Energy is not just an economic commodity between Canada and the United States. It is strategic infrastructure. It influences trade negotiations, economic security, investment flows, and diplomatic leverage. When pipeline discussions reappear near leadership meetings, it signals that both sides understand the weight of that infrastructure in shaping their future relationship. So instead of asking whether Keystone XL is coming back, the smarter question may be this. Are Canada and the United States quietly reinforcing the backbone of their economic partnership during a period of global uncertainty? Because if they are, that tells us something bigger than one project. It tells us that beneath public debates, the structural ties between these two economies remain strong, pragmatic, and strategically calculated. And that is the kind of development investors, policymakers, and citizens should watch carefully in the months ahead.